Sarah Martinez stood in her new kitchen, looking out the window at the perfect suburban street. Every house looked the same. White fences, green lawns, and flower beds that seemed to be planted by the same person. She had been living in Willowbrook Estates for 6 months now, and she still felt like she was living in a movie set. The moving truck had pulled away on a cold February morning. Sarah and her husband David had finally found what they thought was the perfect place to call home. After years of Sarah being away on work trips, they wanted somewhere quiet and safe. Somewhere normal. Sarah worked for the government, but she could never tell people exactly what she did. When neighbors asked, she would smile and say she was in consulting. It was easier that way. The truth was much more complicated. Sarah was part of an elite military unit called Delta Force. She had spent the last 15 years in some of the most dangerous places in the world. She had skills that most people only saw in movies. But here in Willowbrook Estates, she was just Sarah Martinez, the friendly neighbor who worked from home and kept to herself. David worked as an engineer for a tech company. He traveled sometimes, but not like Sarah used to. He was tired of the long deployments and the worry. He wanted a normal life with his wife, a life where he did not have to wonder if she would come home safe. The neighborhood seemed perfect for that kind of life. The houses were all well kept. The streets were clean. Children rode bikes on the sidewalks. Families walked their dogs in the evening. It looked like something from a television commercial. There was even a homeowners association, or HOA, that made sure everything stayed perfect. The HOA had rules about what color you could paint your house, how tall your grass could be, and where you could park your car. Sarah had read through all 23 pages of rules before they bought the house. She was used to following orders and regulations. What Sarah did not know was that there was trouble brewing in paradise. Rick Brennan had been living in Willowbrook Estates for 8 years. He was 42 years old, divorced, and angry about most things in life. He had tried to join the police force twice, but failed the psychological tests both times. He had tried the military, but was kicked out during basic training for fighting with other recruits. Rick worked at a warehouse during the day, loading trucks and moving boxes. It was not the life he had dreamed of. He felt like the world owed him something better. He felt like people did not respect him the way they should. 2 years ago, Rick had discovered the HOA. He started going to meetings and volunteering for committees. He learned all the rules and regulations. He bought a uniform that looked like a police uniform and a badge that said HOA Security. Neither was official, but most neighbors did not know that. Rick began patrolling the neighborhood in his free time. He would walk around with a clipboard, writing down violations. A garbage can left out too long, a car parked 6 inches over the line, flowers planted in the wrong color. At first, people thought Rick was just being helpful. The neighborhood did look better when everyone followed the rules. But Rick began to enjoy the power too much. He started being rude to people. He would yell at children for riding bikes on the grass. He would argue with homeowners about rules that did not even exist. Rick bought more equipment. He got a utility belt with a flashlight, handcuffs, and pepper spray. He bought a 2-way radio even though he was the only one using it. He started wearing military-style boots and a tactical vest. He looked like he was ready for war, not neighborhood patrol. The other neighbors began to get scared. Mrs. Peterson, an elderly woman who lived alone, stopped gardening because Rick had yelled at her for planting the wrong type of roses. The Johnson family put their house up for sale after Rick wrote them 17 violation notices in 1 month. But no one knew what to do about Rick. He had not broken any laws exactly. He was just mean and scary. The real HOA board members lived in other parts of the neighborhood and rarely saw Rick in action. When people complained, Rick would show his fake badge and talk about his authority. Sarah noticed Rick during her first week in the neighborhood. She was unpacking boxes in the garage when she heard yelling from across the street. Rick was standing in the Patel family's driveway, pointing at their car and waving his clipboard. Sarah watched carefully. Her training had taught her to observe people and situations. She could tell that Rick was trying to look intimidating, but he was not very good at it. His stance was wrong. His voice was too loud. He was compensating for something. She also noticed the bulge under Rick's vest. Sarah had carried enough weapons to know what they looked like when someone was trying to hide them. Rick was armed and he was not supposed to be. David came home that evening and found Sarah looking out the front window. "What are you watching?" he asked. "The neighbor across the street," Sarah said. There is something off about him. David looked where she was pointing. Rick was walking down the sidewalk, talking into his radio. His boots made loud clicking sounds on the concrete. He looks like he is playing dress-up, David said. Sarah nodded. Dangerous dress-up. Over the next few weeks, Sarah learned more about Rick from other neighbors. Mrs. Chen told her about the fake badge. Mr. Williams explained how Rick had made his teenage son cry over a basketball left in the driveway. The mailman warned Sarah that Rick sometimes followed him around, claiming he was checking for mail theft. Sarah began to understand that Rick was not just annoying. He was escalating. Every week he got a little more aggressive, a little more bold, a little more dangerous. She had seen this pattern before in her work. People who craved power and control but had no real authority often became unpredictable. They would keep pushing boundaries until someone pushed back. The problem was that most people in Willowbrook Estates were not equipped to handle someone like Rick. Sarah was different. She had handled much worse than Rick Brennan, but she hoped she would never have to prove it. For now, she would watch and wait. She would be the normal neighbor with the normal life. She would water her flowers, walk her dog, and wave at people from her front porch. But she would also be ready, just in case the perfect neighborhood was not as safe as it seemed. The first time Rick Brennan targeted the Martinez family was on a sunny Saturday morning in late March. Sarah was in the backyard, planting tomatoes in small pots. She wore old jeans and a t-shirt, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. To anyone watching, she looked like a normal suburban wife working in her garden. David was inside, making breakfast and reading the news on his tablet. The smell of bacon filled the house. It was the kind of peaceful morning they had moved to Willowbrook Estates to enjoy. Sarah heard boots on the concrete before she saw Rick. The heavy, deliberate steps were meant to announce his presence. She continued planting, but her senses went on alert. Years of training had taught her to stay calm while gathering information. "Excuse me," Rick called out in a loud voice. "Ma'am, I need to speak with you." Sarah looked up from her tomato plants. Rick stood at the edge of her backyard, holding his clipboard and wearing his fake uniform. Up close, she could see that his badge was crooked and his belt was too tight. He was trying to look official, but he just looked silly. "Good morning," Sarah said politely. "What can I help you with?" Rick puffed out his chest. "I am conducting a neighborhood inspection." "Your grass is half an inch too long." Sarah looked at her lawn. The grass was perfectly normal. She had David mow it every week, just like the HOA rules required. "I think there might be a mistake," Sarah said calmly. "We mowed it 3 days ago." Rick's face turned red. "Are you questioning my authority? I have been doing this for 2 years. I know what the regulations say." Sarah stood up slowly, brushing dirt off her hands. She was 5'6", not particularly tall or intimidating, but something in the way she moved made Rick take a step back. "I am not questioning anything," Sarah said. "I am just telling you when we mowed the grass." Rick scribbled something on his clipboard with angry strokes. "Well, it is too long now. You have 24 hours to fix it or I will write you up for a violation." He stomped away, his boots clicking loudly on the sidewalk. Sarah watched him go, noting how he walked and held himself. Rick was angry and frustrated, but he was also scared. Scared people with fake authority were dangerous. David came outside with 2 cups of coffee. "What was that about?" "The neighbor thinks our grass is too long," Sarah said. David looked at their perfectly normal lawn. "That is crazy. Should I go talk to him?" Sarah thought about it. "Not yet. Let us see what happens." What happened was that Rick came back the next week. This time he had a problem with their mailbox. It was 6 inches too far from the curb, he said. Then he complained about a package that had been delivered to their front porch. Then he said their car was parked crooked in their own driveway. Each time, Sarah stayed calm and polite. Each time, David got more frustrated. Each time, Rick got more aggressive. "This is harassment," David said after Rick's 4th visit. "We should call the police and tell them what?" Sarah asked. "That our neighbor is mean?" David knew she was right. Rick had not actually done anything illegal yet. He was just being a bully with a fake badge, but other neighbors were starting to talk. Mrs. Peterson told Sarah that Rick had made her grandson cry by yelling at him for chalk drawings on the sidewalk. The Johnsons had indeed put their house up for sale, and they told everyone it was because of Rick. "He follows me when I check the mail," Mrs. Chen whispered to Sarah at the grocery store. "He writes down what time I get my packages." Sarah began to understand that Rick was not just bothering her family. He was terrorizing the entire neighborhood. People were afraid to go outside. Children stopped playing in their yards. The perfect suburban community was becoming a place of fear. Sarah also noticed that Rick was getting bolder. He stayed longer during each visit. He stood closer when he talked. He raised his voice more often. And most importantly, he touched the bulge under his vest more frequently. Sarah knew that bulge was a gun. She was almost certain now. Rick was carrying a weapon while he played neighborhood cop. That changed everything. One evening, David came home from work looking angry. Rick stopped me in the driveway, he said. He wanted to search my car. Sarah looked up from her book. What did you tell him? I told him to get lost. But Sarah, he was acting really strange. He kept putting his hand on his belt like he had something there. Sarah nodded. She had been expecting this. Rick was escalating just like she knew he would. Soon he would cross a line that could not be uncrossed. We need to start documenting everything, Sarah said. Write down every time he comes here, what he says, how he acts. David agreed, but he also wanted to fight back. I should go to the HOA board. This has to stop. Sarah had already thought of that. I looked into it. The real HOA board meets once a month, and they do not really know what Rick is doing. He is not officially working for them. So he is just some crazy guy with a fake badge? Yes, and that makes him more dangerous, not less. The next incident happened when David was at work. Sarah was alone, working on her laptop in the kitchen when she heard Rick's boots on the front walkway. She looked out the window and saw him taking pictures of their house with his phone. Sarah went outside. Can I help you with something? Rick looked guilty for just a moment, then put on his angry face. I am documenting violations for my report. What violations? Rick pointed at their flower bed. Those flowers are not on the approved list. Sarah looked at the red tulips she had planted. They were beautiful and perfectly normal. I did not know there was an approved list. Well, there is, and those are not on it. Sarah realized that Rick was making up rules now. He was getting desperate for reasons to harass them. That made him even more unpredictable. Could you show me this list? Sarah asked. Rick's face got redder. I do not have to show you anything. I am the authority here. Sarah kept her voice calm and level. I would just like to understand the rules so I can follow them. The rule is that I say what goes in this neighborhood. And I say those flowers have to go. Rick stepped closer to Sarah. She could smell his cologne and see the sweat on his forehead. His hand moved toward his belt where the bulge was hidden under his vest. For just a moment, Sarah let her training take over. Her weight shifted to the balls of her feet. Her hands relaxed at her sides. Her eyes focused on Rick's center of mass, not his face. Rick must have sensed something because he stopped moving forward. For a few seconds, they stood there looking at each other. Sarah appeared calm and relaxed, but something in her stillness made Rick nervous. Just get rid of the flowers, Rick said finally. He turned and walked away, but his steps were faster than usual. Sarah went back inside and called David at work. He is getting worse, she said, and I think he has a gun. David was quiet for a moment. Should we move? Sarah thought about all the other neighbors who were scared. Mrs. Peterson with her grandson, the Chen family checking their mail in fear, the children who could not play outside. No, Sarah said, but we need to be ready for whatever comes next. That night, Sarah did something she had not done since moving to Willowbrook Estates. She checked the locks on all the doors and windows. She made sure she knew where every exit was. She reviewed her mental list of potential weapons in the house. She did not tell David what she was doing. He worried about her enough already. But Sarah Martinez, Delta Force operator, was preparing for battle. Even if it was just against one angry man with a fake badge in a perfect suburban neighborhood. The week leading up to the confrontation was the worst yet. Rick Brennan seemed to be everywhere at once, and his behavior was getting stranger by the day. On Monday, Sarah saw him following the mailman down the street. Rick stayed about 20 feet behind, pretending to check addresses on his clipboard. The mailman, a friendly guy named Tony who had been working the route for 10 years, kept looking over his shoulder nervously. On Tuesday, Rick stationed himself at the neighborhood entrance and stopped every delivery truck that came through. He demanded to see their paperwork and asked where they were going. 2 drivers called their companies to complain. One pizza delivery guy just turned around and left. On Wednesday, Rick started using a whistle. He would blow it whenever he saw what he thought was a violation. The sharp sound echoed through the quiet streets, making babies cry and dogs bark. By evening, half the neighborhood was on edge. David had a business trip planned for the weekend. He was supposed to leave Friday morning and come back Sunday night. As the day got closer, he became more worried about leaving Sarah alone. "Maybe I should cancel," he said Thursday night over dinner. "Rick is acting really crazy lately." Sarah cut her chicken calmly. "You have been planning this trip for months. The company needs you there." "The company can wait. You are more important," Sarah looked at her husband. David was a good man who loved her and wanted to protect her. But he had no idea what she was capable of protecting herself. In her years with Delta Force, she had faced down terrorists, warlords, and enemy soldiers. Rick Brennan was just a frustrated man with delusions of power. "I will be fine," she said. "Besides, what is the worst that could happen?" She would regret those words later. Friday morning came gray and drizzly. David loaded his suitcase into the car and gave Sarah a long hug goodbye. "Keep your phone on," he said. "And if Rick bothers you, call the police right away." "I will," Sarah promised. She stood in the doorway and waved as David drove away. She did not see Rick watching from his living room window across the street. Rick had been waiting for this moment. He had learned David's schedule by watching the house for weeks. He knew when David left for work, when he came home, and when he traveled. Rick had been planning what he would do when he got Sarah alone. In Rick's mind, Sarah was the problem. She was the one who questioned his authority. She was the one who stayed calm when she should have been scared. She was the one who made him feel small and stupid, even though she never said anything rude. Rick had convinced himself that Sarah thought she was better than him. Maybe because she was educated. Maybe because she had money. Maybe because she was not impressed by his uniform and badge like other people were. Well, Rick was going to show her who was really in charge of this neighborhood. Sarah spent Friday morning cleaning the house and doing laundry. It felt good to have normal tasks to focus on. She was folding towels when she heard Rick's boots on the front walkway. Sarah looked at the clock. It was 10:30 in the morning. Rick usually did his patrols in the evening after work. Coming this early was unusual. The doorbell rang once, then twice, then 3 times in quick succession. Rick was being impatient. Sarah walked to the front door and looked through the peephole. Rick stood on her porch wearing his full fake uniform. His utility belt looked heavier than usual. His face was red and sweaty, even though the morning was cool. Sarah opened the door but left the security chain attached. "Good morning, Rick. What can I help you with?" Rick's eyes were wild and angry. "Open this door. I need to conduct a full property inspection." "I am sorry, but I do not think that is necessary," Sarah said calmly. "We have not had any violations lately." Rick's voice got louder. "I decide what is necessary. I am the authority here." Sarah had dealt with angry men before. Many times. The key was to stay calm and not escalate the situation. "Rick, I think there might be some confusion about your role with the HOA." "There is no confusion," Rick shouted. "Open this door right now or I will report you for obstruction." Sarah could see neighbors starting to peer out their windows. Mrs. Peterson was watching from across the street. The Chen family had come to their front door. This was exactly what Rick wanted, an audience for his show of power. "Rick, I am going to close the door now," Sarah said. "If you have official HOA business, you can send me a letter." She started to close the door, but Rick slammed his hand against it. "Do not walk away from me," he screamed. "I am not done talking to you." Sarah felt the door shake against the security chain. Rick was trying to force his way in. That crossed a line. That was attempted breaking and entering. Sarah's training kicked in automatically. Her mind became very clear and focused. She assessed the situation in seconds. One hostile individual, possibly armed, trying to enter her home by force. Multiple civilians in the area who could be hurt. No backup available. Sarah stepped back from the door and spoke in a voice that was completely calm. "Rick, you need to step away from my door right now." Something in her tone made Rick pause. It was not loud or angry. It was the kind of quiet, controlled voice that people used when they were very serious about something. "You cannot tell me what to do," Rick said, but his voice was not as confident as before. "I am telling you to leave my property," Sarah said. "This is your warning." Rick laughed, but it sounded forced. "Warning? You are going to warn me? Lady, you have no idea who you are dealing with." Sarah almost smiled at that. Rick was absolutely right. He had no idea who he was dealing with. Rick pulled out his phone and started taking pictures through the gap in the door. I am documenting your refusal to cooperate with HOA regulations. Sarah closed the door completely and turned the deadbolt. She could hear Rick on the other side still shouting and taking pictures. This is not over, Rick yelled. I will be back, and next time you will show me some respect. Sarah watched through the peephole as Rick stomped off her porch, but instead of leaving, he went to his car and got a folding chair. He set it up on the sidewalk across from her house and sat down, staring at her front door. Sarah realized that Rick was planning to watch her house all day. He was escalating from harassment to stalking. This was getting dangerous. She thought about calling the police, but she knew what would happen. Rick would say he was just sitting on a public sidewalk. He had not actually broken any laws yet. The police would ask him to move along, and he would come back later even angrier. Sarah decided to wait and see what Rick would do next. She went about her day normally, but she kept watch through the windows. Rick sat in his chair for 3 hours, occasionally getting up to walk around her yard and take more pictures. At 2 p.m., Rick finally left. Sarah thought the crisis was over for the day. She was wrong. Rick came back at 5 p.m. with more equipment. He had a camera with a long lens. He had a cooler full of drinks. He had a notebook where he wrote down everything Sarah did. Sarah realized that Rick was preparing for a long siege. He was trying to make her feel trapped in her own home. He wanted her to be afraid. But Sarah Martinez had spent years in places where being afraid could get you killed. She had learned to turn fear into focus, panic into planning. As the sun set over Willowbrook Estates, Sarah prepared for whatever Rick would do next. She checked her phone to make sure it was charged. She made sure all the doors and windows were locked. She reviewed the quickest routes out of the house, and she thought about the conversation she might have to have with David when he called that night. How do you tell your husband that the neighborhood bully was becoming a real threat? How do you explain that you were not afraid, but that you were getting ready for a fight? Sarah looked out the window one more time. Rick was still there, sitting in his chair under the streetlight, watching her house like a predator watching prey. But Rick had made one big mistake. He thought Sarah was the prey. He was about to learn how wrong he was. Saturday morning dawned bright and clear. Sarah woke up early, as she always did, and looked out her bedroom window. Rick's chair was gone from the sidewalk, but his car was still parked across the street. He was probably sleeping in it, Sarah realized. He had spent the night watching her house. This was beyond harassment now. This was stalking, and it was escalating quickly. Sarah made coffee and toast, trying to keep her routine normal. But her senses were on high alert. Every sound from outside made her look toward the windows. Every car that drove by could be Rick coming back. At 8 a.m., her phone rang. It was David calling from his hotel. Good morning, beautiful, David said. How did everything go yesterday? Sarah thought about telling him the truth. About Rick trying to force his way into the house. About him sitting outside all day taking pictures. About him spending the night in his car. But David was 300 miles away at an important business meeting. There was nothing he could do except worry, and Sarah could handle Rick Brennan. Everything was fine, she said. How was your conference? They talked for 10 minutes about his meetings and her plans for the day. Sarah managed to sound normal and relaxed. David had enough stress at work without worrying about problems at home. After she hung up, Sarah felt guilty about lying. But she also felt determined. Rick was her problem to solve. At 9 a.m., Rick emerged from his car. He looked terrible. His hair was messy, his uniform was wrinkled, and he had not shaved. But his eyes were bright and angry. He had been planning something all night. Rick walked straight to Sarah's front door and rang the doorbell. When she did not answer, he rang it again. And again. And again. Sarah watched through the peephole. Rick's behavior was even more erratic than yesterday. He was talking to himself and gesturing wildly. He looked like a man who had not slept and was running on anger and caffeine. After 5 minutes of constant doorbell ringing, Rick gave up and walked around to the backyard. Sarah heard him rattling the gate, trying to get in. The gate was locked, but Rick was persistent. Sarah called 911. 911, what is your emergency? This is Sarah Martinez at 1247 Elm Street. There is a man trying to break into my backyard. He has been harassing me for weeks. Is he still there now? Yes, I can hear him at my back gate. We are sending a unit. Stay inside and keep your doors locked. Sarah hung up and continued watching Rick through the windows. He had given up on the gate and was now taking pictures of her house from every angle. He was building some kind of case in his mind, documenting evidence of crimes that did not exist. The police arrived 15 minutes later. 2 officers in a patrol car pulled up in front of Sarah's house. Rick immediately walked over to them, pulling out his fake badge. Sarah could not hear what Rick was saying, but she could see him gesturing toward her house and pointing at his clipboard. He was trying to convince the police that he was the victim. One of the officers came to Sarah's door while the other stayed with Rick. "Ma'am, I am Officer Johnson. You called about someone trying to break in?" Sarah opened the door and explained the situation. She told the officer about weeks of harassment, about Rick's fake badge and uniform, about him trying to force his way into her house yesterday. Officer Johnson listened carefully and took notes. "Has he threatened you directly?" "Not in words," Sarah said, "but his behavior is getting more aggressive every day, and I think he might be carrying a weapon." Officer Johnson looked back at Rick, who was still talking animatedly to the other officer. "We will handle this, ma'am. Stay inside while we sort this out." Sarah watched through her window as the 2 officers talked to Rick for 20 minutes. Rick showed them his fake badge and his clipboard full of violations. He pointed at Sarah's house repeatedly. Finally, the officers got back in their car and drove away. Rick stood in the street watching them leave. Then he turned and stared directly at Sarah's front window. Even from 50 feet away, Sarah could see the rage in Rick's eyes. The police visit had not scared him. It had made him angrier. Rick walked back to his car and sat down in the driver's seat. But he did not start the engine. He just sat there staring at Sarah's house. Sarah's phone rang. It was Officer Johnson. "Mrs. Martinez, we talked to your neighbor. He says he is working for the HOA, and that you have been violating community rules. Did you ask to see his credentials? He showed us a badge, but we could not verify if it is official. The thing is, he is not actually breaking any laws by sitting on a public street." Sarah felt frustrated but not surprised. "What about him trying to get into my backyard?" "He says he was just inspecting the fence for violations. Without witnesses or video, it is his word against yours. So there is nothing you can do?" Officer Johnson sighed. "We told him to stay off your property and to stop ringing your doorbell. If he violates that, call us immediately. But ma'am, between you and me, this guy seems unstable. Be careful." Sarah thanked the officer and hung up. She looked out the window again. Rick was still sitting in his car, but now he was talking on his phone. Sarah wondered who he was calling. Did Rick have friends who would help him? Was he planning something bigger? The answer came 2 hours later. At noon, a pickup truck pulled up behind Rick's car. 2 men got out. They were both wearing military-style clothing and carrying equipment bags. Sarah recognized the type immediately. Wannabe soldiers who bought their gear at surplus stores and played weekend warrior games. Rick got out of his car and greeted the men like old friends. They talked for a few minutes. Then all 3 of them started looking at Sarah's house and pointing. Sarah realized that Rick had called for backup. He was not just one angry man anymore. He was part of a group. Sarah's training told her to gather intelligence. She needed to know what she was dealing with. She went upstairs to her bedroom, which had the best view of the street, and watched through the curtains. The 3 men were setting up what looked like a surveillance operation. They had chairs, a cooler, binoculars, and cameras. One of them had a radio. They were acting like they were on some kind of military mission. Sarah recognized the pattern. These were the kind of men who had never seen real combat but fantasized about it. They bought tactical gear and played soldier in their spare time. They were dangerous because they had weapons and training but no discipline or judgment. At 2 p.m., one of Rick's friends walked up to Sarah's front door and knocked. Sarah did not answer. The man knocked louder, then started shouting, "We know you are in there. Come out and talk to us like an adult." Sarah called 911 again. This time she emphasized that there were now 3 men harassing her and that they appeared to be armed. The police took longer to respond this time, almost 30 minutes. When they arrived, Rick's friends had disappeared, leaving only Rick sitting in his car. The officers talked to Rick again, but without his friends there, they could not do much. Rick claimed he was just exercising his right to sit on a public street. Sarah realized that Rick was getting smarter. He was only breaking the law when the police were not around. He was learning to game the system. After the police left, Rick's friends came back. They set up their surveillance operation again. But this time they were more careful. They stayed on public property and did not make any noise. Sarah called David at 4:00 p.m. "How is your day going?" David asked. "It has been interesting," Sarah said carefully. "Rick has some friends with him now." David's voice immediately became concerned. "What kind of friends?" "The kind that like to play soldier." There was silence on the other end of the line. David knew his wife well enough to understand what she was not saying. "I am coming home," David said. "I will drive all night if I have to." "No," Sarah said firmly. "Finish your meetings. I can handle this." "Sarah, if there are multiple people involved, then I am still better trained than all of them combined." David was quiet for a moment. He rarely heard Sarah reference her military background so directly. "Promise me you will call the police if anything happens." "I promise." After she hung up, Sarah looked out the window again. The three men were still there, taking turns watching her house through binoculars. They had been there for 6 hours now. They were committed to whatever they were planning. Sarah went to her bedroom closet and pushed aside some old clothes. Hidden in the back was a small safe that David did not know about. Inside the safe were items from her old life, items she hoped she would never need in suburban America. Sarah took out a small device that looked like a regular cell phone. It was actually a military-grade communication system that could contact her old unit in an emergency. She had not used it in 2 years. Sarah also took out a knife that was designed to look like a normal kitchen utility blade, but was actually a combat weapon. She clipped it to her belt under her shirt. Sarah Martinez, suburban housewife, was preparing to become Sarah Martinez, Delta Force operator. She hoped it would not come to that. But as she watched Rick and his friends planning their next move, she realized that hope might not be enough. The sun was setting over Willowbrook Estates, and the perfect neighborhood was about to become a battlefield. Sunday morning arrived with an eerie quiet. Sarah woke up at 5:30 a.m., her internal clock still set to military time. She looked out her bedroom window and was surprised to see that Rick's surveillance operation was gone. The street looked normal again. Maybe Rick had given up. Maybe his friends had talked sense into him. Maybe the police visits had finally worked. Sarah allowed herself to hope that the crisis was over. She was wrong. At 7 a.m., Sarah went outside to get the newspaper from her driveway. It was a small act of defiance, a way of showing that she would not be trapped in her own home by Rick's intimidation. The morning air was cool and fresh. Birds were singing in the trees. A few neighbors were out walking their dogs. Everything seemed perfectly normal. Sarah bent down to pick up the newspaper, and that is when Rick appeared. He had been hiding behind the large oak tree in her front yard, waiting for her to come outside. Sarah realized that he had probably been there for hours, watching and planning. Rick looked worse than ever. His uniform was dirty and wrinkled. His eyes were bloodshot and wild. His hands were shaking slightly, either from caffeine or adrenaline or both. "Finally," Rick said, stepping out from behind the tree. "I have been waiting to talk to you." Sarah straightened up slowly, still holding the newspaper. Her training kicked in immediately. She assessed the situation in seconds. One hostile individual approximately 10 feet away. Hands visible but twitchy. Unknown weapon status. Multiple escape routes available. "Good morning, Rick," Sarah said calmly. "What can I help you with?" Rick laughed, but it was not a happy sound. "Help me? You can start by showing me some respect. You can stop thinking you are better than everyone else in this neighborhood." Sarah kept her voice level and non-threatening. "I have never said I was better than anyone." "You do not have to say it," Rick spat. "I can see it in your face. Every time I try to do my job, you look at me like I am some kind of joke." Sarah realized that Rick's anger was not really about HOA violations or neighborhood rules. It was about his own insecurity and failure. He saw her calm confidence as a personal insult. "Rick, I think there has been a misunderstanding," Sarah said. "I respect what you are trying to do for the neighborhood." Rick's face turned red. "Do not lie to me. You called the cops on me yesterday. You tried to get me arrested. I called them because I was concerned about your behavior. You have been watching my house for days. I was doing my job." Rick screamed. "I was investigating violations. But you think you are too good to follow the rules like everyone else?" Rick took a step closer to Sarah. She could smell his unwashed body and see the sweat stains on his shirt. He had not gone home last night. He had been planning this confrontation for hours. Rick, I think you should go home and get some rest, Sarah said. We can talk about this later when you are feeling better. Something in Rick's brain snapped at those words. Sarah had spoken to him like he was a child having a tantrum. In Rick's twisted mind, she was dismissing him again, treating him like he did not matter. I am done talking, Rick said through gritted teeth. You are going to listen to me for once. Rick reached under his tactical vest and pulled out a black pistol. It was a cheap knockoff of a police service weapon, but it was still deadly. Several things happened at once. Mrs. Peterson, who was walking her small dog across the street, screamed and dropped the leash. Her dog ran toward the house in confusion. Mr. Chen, who was getting into his car to go to work, ducked behind his vehicle and started fumbling for his cell phone. The Johnsons' teenage son, who was leaving for soccer practice, froze on his front porch with his gear bag in his hands, and Sarah Martinez became very, very still. Rick waved the gun wildly, pointing it at Sarah's chest. Now do I have your attention? Now do you respect me? Sarah's entire body relaxed into a combat stance that had been drilled into her through thousands of hours of training. Her weight shifted to the balls of her feet. Her hands hung loose at her sides. Her breathing became deep and controlled, but to Rick, she just looked like a scared suburban housewife. Rick, Sarah said in a voice that was completely calm, you need to put the gun down. Rick laughed again. I need to? You are not giving orders anymore, lady. I am in charge here. Sarah's eyes never left Rick's center of mass. She was not looking at the gun, because the gun was not the threat. Rick was the threat, and Rick was holding the gun wrong, standing wrong, breathing wrong. He was an amateur playing with a deadly weapon. Rick, there are children in this neighborhood, Sarah said. Someone could get hurt. Someone is going to get hurt if you do not start showing me some respect, Rick said. I am tired of you thinking you are better than me. I'm tired of you looking down on me. Sarah could see neighbors starting to peer out their windows. Mrs. Peterson was crying and calling 911 on her phone. Mr. Chen was recording everything with his cell phone camera. Sarah realized that Rick was not just threatening her anymore. He was creating a hostage situation in front of multiple witnesses, including children. This had gone beyond harassment or intimidation. Rick was now a clear and present danger to innocent people. What do you want me to do? Sarah asked. Rick's eyes lit up. Finally, he was getting what he had always craved, fear and submission from someone he saw as superior. I want you to apologize, Rick said. I want you to admit that I am the authority in this neighborhood. I want you to get on your knees and show me some respect. Sarah looked at Rick for a long moment. She thought about all the real threats she had faced in her career. Terrorists with bombs, enemy soldiers with automatic weapons, warlords with armies. Rick Brennan, failed police recruit with a fake badge and a cheap pistol, was not even close to the most dangerous person she had ever faced. But he was dangerous enough to hurt innocent people. And that made him a problem that needed to be solved. Okay, Rick, Sarah said quietly. You win. Sarah began to lower herself toward the ground as if she was going to kneel. Rick's face broke into a triumphant grin. Finally, he was getting the respect he deserved. But Sarah Martinez had never knelt to anyone in her life, and she was not about to start with Rick Brennan. As she bent down, Sarah's right hand moved to the small knife clipped to her belt. Her left hand shifted position slightly, preparing for what came next. Rick was so focused on his moment of victory that he did not notice Sarah's subtle movements. He did not see her muscles coiling like springs. He did not recognize the deadly calm that had settled over her. That is right, Rick said, pointing the gun directly at Sarah's head. Now you know who is really in charge here. Sarah looked up at Rick from her crouched position. For just a moment, Rick saw something in her eyes that made his stomach drop. It was not fear or submission. It was pity. And then Sarah Martinez, Delta Force operator, showed Rick Brennan exactly who he was dealing with. The entire sequence took less than 2 seconds. To the witnesses watching from their windows, it happened so fast that they could barely follow it. Sarah exploded upward from her crouch like a coiled spring. Her left hand swept up and knocked Rick's gun arm to the side. Her right hand came up with the knife, stopping just short of Rick's throat. Before Rick could even think about pulling the trigger, he was face down on Sarah's driveway with his arm twisted behind his back and his gun lying 10 feet away. Sarah knelt on Rick's back, applying just enough pressure to keep him immobilized without causing permanent damage. Her knife had disappeared back into her belt so quickly that most witnesses never saw it. "Rick," Sarah said in a voice that was still perfectly calm. "You are going to lie very still while we wait for the police." Rick tried to struggle, but quickly realized that he could not move at all. Sarah's grip was like steel. He felt like he was being held down by a machine. "How did you—" Rick gasped. "You picked the wrong house," Sarah said quietly. "You picked the wrong neighborhood. And you definitely picked the wrong woman to threaten." In the distance, sirens were already approaching. Mrs. Peterson's 911 call had worked. Help was on the way, but Rick Brennan was already learning that he had never needed help more in his life. Sarah looked up at the neighbors who were starting to come out of their houses. "Everything is under control," she called out. "The police will be here soon." As she waited for the authorities to arrive, Sarah reflected on how quickly her perfect suburban life had turned into a combat situation. She had hoped to leave her old life behind when she moved to Willowbrook Estates. But sometimes the old life was exactly what was needed to protect the new one. The first police car arrived 3 minutes after Sarah had disarmed Rick. Officer Johnson was behind the wheel, the same cop who had responded to Sarah's previous calls. He stepped out of his patrol car and immediately saw Rick lying face down on the driveway with Sarah kneeling beside him. "Mrs. Martinez," Officer Johnson called out, his hand resting on his service weapon. "What is the situation here?" "The situation is under control," Sarah replied calmly. "This man pulled a gun on me. I disarmed him. The weapon is over there by the mailbox." Officer Johnson looked where Sarah pointed and saw Rick's pistol lying on the concrete. He called for backup and approached slowly. "Are you injured, ma'am?" "No injuries," Sarah said. "But this man needs medical attention. I think he has been awake for more than 24 hours. Rick was breathing heavily and mumbling incoherently. The adrenaline from his confrontation with Sarah was wearing off and exhaustion was setting in. "Sir, I am going to need you to stay very still," Officer Johnson told Rick. "Mrs. Martinez, can you please step back slowly?" Sarah released her hold on Rick and stood up. Rick immediately tried to get up and run, but his legs gave out after 2 steps. He collapsed on the driveway, too tired and confused to be dangerous anymore. Officer Johnson handcuffed Rick while 2 more patrol cars arrived. Within minutes, Sarah's quiet street was full of police vehicles and flashing lights. Detective Maria Santos arrived 15 minutes later. She was a veteran investigator with 20 years of experience, and she had seen enough crime scenes to know when something unusual had happened. "Mrs. Martinez," Detective Santos said, "I need to ask you some questions about what happened here." "Of course," Sarah replied. Detective Santos looked at Rick, who was now sitting in the back of a patrol car, then at the gun that had been secured as evidence, then back at Sarah. "Can you walk me through exactly what happened?" Sarah gave a clear, precise account of the morning's events. She described Rick's behavior over the past weeks, his escalation to stalking, and finally his decision to threaten her with a weapon. "And then, what did you do?" Detective Santos asked. "I disarmed him." Detective Santos raised an eyebrow. "You disarmed him? A man with a gun?" "Yes." "How exactly did you do that?" Sarah was quiet for a moment. She had been dreading this question. Once she answered it, her cover would be blown. David would learn the truth about her past. Her neighbors would know she was not just a normal suburban housewife, but there were multiple witnesses and video evidence from Mr. Chen's phone. The truth was going to come out anyway. "I have military training," Sarah said simply. Detective Santos studied Sarah's face. "What kind of military training?" Sarah reached into her back pocket and pulled out a small leather wallet. Inside was an identification card that most police officers would never see in their entire careers. Detective Santos looked at the card, and her eyes widened. She was looking at classified military credentials for someone in Delta Force, one of the most elite special operations units in the world. "Holy shit," Detective Santos whispered, then caught herself. "Sorry, ma'am. This explains a lot." Word spread quickly among the responding officers. Within minutes, every cop on the scene knew they were dealing with someone whose security clearance was higher than their police chiefs. Officer Johnson, who had initially been skeptical of Sarah's story, now looked at her with newfound respect. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology. We should have taken your earlier complaints more seriously." "You could not have known how dangerous he would become," Sarah said. "But I could. I have seen this pattern before." Detective Santos interviewed several neighbors who had witnessed the confrontation. Mrs. Peterson, despite being shaken up, gave a clear account of Rick pulling the gun. Mr. Chen provided his cell phone video, which showed the entire incident. The video is remarkable, Detective Santos told Sarah. You moved so fast that I had to watch it in slow motion to see what you did. Where did you learn to disarm someone like that? Training, Sarah said. Lots of training. Meanwhile, Rick was becoming more coherent as he sat in the patrol car. He kept asking how Sarah had overpowered him so easily. She is just some suburban housewife, Rick kept saying. How did she do that? Officer Martinez, who was guarding Rick, finally got tired of his questions. Buddy, that suburban housewife is Delta Force. You just pulled a gun on one of America's most elite soldiers. Rick's face went white. That is impossible. She works in consulting. Yeah, she consults on how to neutralize threats like you. As the morning progressed, more details came out about Rick's background. Detective Santos ran his criminal history and discovered that he had been arrested twice for impersonating a police officer in other states. He had also been fired from 3 different security jobs for aggressive behavior. This guy has been escalating for years, Detective Santos told Sarah. You probably saved lives by stopping him here. Sarah's phone rang. It was David calling from his hotel. I just saw the news, David said, his voice full of panic. There are reports about a shooting in our neighborhood. Are you okay? I am fine, Sarah said. But we need to talk when you get home. I am leaving right now. I will drive straight through. David, finish your meetings. There is nothing you can do here that the police are not already handling. There was a long pause. Sarah, the news is saying that someone was arrested for pulling a gun on a neighbor. Was that Rick? Yes, another pause. And you were the neighbor? Yes. Are you hurt? No, I am fine. How are you fine? How did you get away from someone with a gun? Sarah looked around at all the police officers who now knew her secret. We will talk about it when you get home. Detective Santos finished taking statements from witnesses and returned to Sarah. Mrs. Martinez, I need to ask you about your current status with the military. I am still active duty, Sarah said. I am just between deployments. Will this incident affect your security clearance? Sarah had been wondering about that herself. I do not know. I will have to report it to my commanding officer. For what it is worth, Detective Santos said, you handled this perfectly. You used minimal force, no one was seriously injured, and you prevented what could have been a mass shooting situation. Sarah had not thought about it that way, but Detective Santos was right. Rick's behavior had been escalating for weeks. If he had not been stopped, he might have eventually used his gun on someone who could not defend themselves. As the police finished their investigation and began to leave, neighbors started approaching Sarah. She had been worried that they would be afraid of her once they learned about her military background. Instead, they were grateful. Mrs. Peterson hugged Sarah with tears in her eyes. Thank you for protecting us. I was so scared of that man. Mr. Chen shook her hand formally. You are a hero. My family feels safe now. Even the teenage Johnson boy who had witnessed the whole thing approached Sarah with obvious admiration. That was the coolest thing I have ever seen. Can you teach me how to do that? Sarah smiled. Ask me again when you are 18. As the last police car drove away, Sarah stood alone in her driveway. The perfect suburban street was quiet again. Children were playing in their yards. People were walking their dogs. Everything looked normal, but Sarah knew that nothing would ever be quite the same. Her secret was out. Her neighbors knew who she really was, and soon David would know too. Sarah looked at Rick's gun, which had left a small scratch on her concrete driveway. Such a little mark from such a big moment. She went inside to clean up and prepare for the conversation she would have to have with her husband. It was going to be a long day, but at least Rick Brennan would never terrorize another neighborhood again. David Martinez drove 12 hours straight to get home. He barely stopped for gas and coffee, his mind racing with questions about what had happened to his wife. The local news reports were confusing and incomplete. All he knew for sure was that their neighbor had been arrested for pulling a gun, and somehow Sarah had been involved. When David pulled into their driveway at 9 p.m. Sunday night, he found Sarah sitting on the front porch swing, waiting for him. She looked calm and normal, but David had learned to read his wife's subtle moods over their 10 years of marriage. She was preparing for a difficult conversation. Are you hurt? David asked before he even got out of the car. I am fine, Sarah said. But we need to talk. David sat down beside her on the swing. The news said someone pulled a gun on you. How did you get away? Sarah took a deep breath. She had been practicing this conversation all day, but it was still hard to know where to start. David, there are things about my work that I have never told you. Things I was not allowed to tell you. David felt his stomach drop. What kind of things? I do not really work in consulting. That is just my cover story. David stared at his wife. Cover story? Sarah, what are you talking about? Sarah pulled out her military identification and handed it to David. He looked at it for a long moment, trying to understand what he was seeing. Delta Force? David said quietly. Sarah, what is Delta Force? Special operations. Very classified. Very dangerous missions. David set the ID down carefully as if it might explode. How long? 15 years. Since before we met. David was quiet for several minutes, processing this information. His wife, the woman he had breakfast with every morning, was apparently one of the most elite soldiers in the world. Those work trips, David said finally. You were not really going to conferences, were you? No, I was deployed overseas. Combat missions. David felt like he was learning about a stranger. Why did you not tell me? I could not. It was classified, and I wanted to protect you. Protect me from what? Sarah looked at her husband's confused face. From knowing that every time I left for work, I might not come home. David began to understand. All those times Sarah had seemed distant before a business trip. All those times she had hugged him extra long when she left. All those times she had checked and double-checked the locks before going to bed. So this morning, David said, when Rick pulled the gun, I handled it the way I was trained to handle threats. You disarmed him? Yes. David shook his head in amazement. I always wondered how you stayed so calm in emergencies. Remember when that drunk driver crashed into the Chen's fence? You took charge like you had done it 100 times before. I had done it 100 times before, just not with car accidents. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the normal sounds of their suburban evening. Somewhere down the street, someone was mowing their lawn. A dog was barking. Children were playing in a backyard. Are you angry? Sarah asked. David thought about it. I do not know. Confused, maybe. Impressed, definitely. But Sarah, this explains so much about you. The way you watch people, the way you notice things, the way you never seem scared of anything. I get scared, Sarah said. I just do not show it. When Rick was threatening you, were you scared? Sarah smiled. I was worried about the neighbors getting hurt. But scared of Rick? No. He was not very good at being threatening. David laughed despite himself. Only my wife would think that a man with a gun was not threatening. It is all about training and experience. Rick had neither. Over the next hour, Sarah told David more about her real job. She could not give him details about specific missions, but she explained what Delta Force did and why it was so secretive. So when you said you worked for the government, David said, you were technically telling the truth. The best cover stories are mostly true, Sarah agreed. David had another thought. What happens now? Will you have to go back to active duty? Sarah had been wondering about that herself. I do not know. I will have to report this incident to my commanding officer. There might be consequences for blowing my cover. What kind of consequences? Best case scenario, they reassign me to a desk job. Worst case, they end my career. David looked at his wife. How do you feel about that? Sarah was quiet for a moment. For the first time in my life, I think I might be ready for a desk job. Or retirement. This morning made me realize that I like being Sarah Martinez, suburban housewife. I like our normal life. Even if it means dealing with neighbors like Rick? Sarah laughed. David, I have dealt with international terrorists. I think I can handle HOA disputes. Monday morning brought a parade of visitors to the Martinez house. First came Detective Santos with an update on Rick's case. He is being charged with assault with a deadly weapon, impersonating a police officer, stalking, and terroristic threats, Detective Santos told Sarah. His lawyer is trying to argue that he did not know he was threatening a trained soldier, but that is not really relevant to the charges. What kind of sentence is he looking at? David asked. With his prior record and the multiple charges, probably 5 to 8 years. Plus, we found evidence that he has been harassing other neighbors for months. Mrs. Peterson is pressing charges for intimidation. The Chen family is filing a restraining order. After Detective Santos left, Sarah's phone rang. It was her commanding officer, Colonel Richards. Martinez, I just got a very interesting report from local police. Care to explain? Sarah gave Colonel Richards a complete briefing on the Rick Brennan situation. She expected to be reprimanded for exposing her identity, but the colonel's response surprised her. You did exactly what you should have done, Colonel Richards said. You protected civilians and neutralized a threat. The fact that it blew your cover is unfortunate, but not your fault. What does this mean for my assignment, sir? Well, you obviously cannot go back to your suburban cover identity. But Martinez, you have been in active combat for 15 years. Have you considered that it might be time for a different kind of service? What kind of service, sir? Training. We need people with your experience to train the next generation of operators. Interested? Sarah looked at David, who was listening to her side of the conversation with obvious interest. Can I think about it, sir? Take all the time you need. But Martinez? Good work yesterday. You made the unit proud. After Sarah hung up, David hugged her tightly. A training position? He asked. It would mean staying stateside. No more deployments. Regular hours. That sounds perfect. The rest of the week brought more revelations about Rick's behavior. It turned out that he had been terrorizing the neighborhood for much longer than anyone realized. Neighbors who had been afraid to speak up before were now coming forward with their own stories. Rick had been following women while they jogged. He had been taking pictures of children playing in their yards. He had been going through people's mail and garbage looking for reasons to cite them for violations. The real HOA board, which had been largely unaware of Rick's activities, was horrified. They issued a formal apology to all residents and implemented new oversight procedures to prevent anyone from abusing their authority in the future. We had no idea what Rick was doing, the HOA president told Sarah. We thought he was just an enthusiastic volunteer. If we had known he was impersonating a police officer and carrying weapons, we would have stopped him immediately. By Friday, the local news had picked up the story. Suburban housewife turns out to be elite soldier ran on the evening news. Sarah's real name and unit were not mentioned to protect her security clearance, but the basic story was public. Sarah and David watched the news report together, holding hands on their couch. How does it feel to be famous? David asked. Weird, Sarah said. I spent 15 years trying to be invisible. Well, you are definitely not invisible anymore. Sarah looked around their living room, at the normal furniture and family photos and all the things that made up their quiet suburban life. You know what? She said. I think I'm okay with that. The perfect neighborhood had been shaken by violence and fear, but it was healing. Children were playing outside again. Neighbors were talking to each other again. People felt safe again. And Sarah Martinez, Delta Force operator turned suburban housewife turned neighborhood hero, was finally ready to figure out what came next. 6 months after the confrontation with Rick Brennan, life in Willowbrook Estates had settled into a new kind of normal. The perfect suburban facade remained, but underneath was something stronger, a community that had been tested and had come together. Rick had been sentenced to 7 years in prison after pleading guilty to multiple felony charges. The judge had been particularly harsh because of Rick's history of impersonating police officers in other states. During sentencing, Rick's lawyer had tried to argue that his client could not have known he was threatening a highly trained soldier, but Judge Martinez had shut that down quickly. The victim's background does not matter, Judge Martinez had said. What matters is that your client pulled a gun on an innocent person in broad daylight. The fact that he picked someone who could defend herself probably saved lives. Rick would also have to pay restitution to several neighbors he had harassed, and he was banned from living in any HOA community when he got out of prison. Sarah had accepted the training position with Delta Force. She now worked at a military base 2 hours away, teaching combat techniques and threat assessment to new recruits. The job required her to commute 3 days a week, but she was home every night and every weekend. David had worried that Sarah would miss the excitement of active combat missions, but she seemed genuinely happy with her new role. It is different, Sarah told him one evening over dinner. But good different. I like teaching people how to stay alive, and I like knowing that I will always come home to you. The new job also meant that Sarah could be more open about her background. She still could not discuss specific missions, but she could tell people what she did for a living without lying. This had led to some interesting changes in the neighborhood. Mrs. Peterson, who was now 73 years old, had asked Sarah to teach her basic self-defense. Every Tuesday morning, Sarah spent an hour in Mrs. Peterson's backyard showing her how to escape from grabs and how to use her walking cane as a weapon. "I never want to feel that helpless again," Mrs. Peterson explained. "When I saw that man with the gun, I froze. I want to know that I can protect myself." The Chen family had asked Sarah to help them design a better security system for their house. Sarah had recommended cameras and motion sensors, but she also taught them how to identify potential threats and when to call police. Even the teenage Johnson boy, who was now 18, had taken Sarah up on her offer to teach him some basic defensive moves. He was planning to join the military after high school, and Sarah had become his informal mentor. "She is like having our own personal superhero living next door," Mrs. Johnson told David at the neighborhood barbecue. The barbecue was another new tradition. After the Rick incident, the neighbors had realized that they barely knew each other despite living so close together. Now they had monthly gatherings where everyone brought food and actually talked to each other. Sarah found that she enjoyed these social events more than she had expected. For years, she had been careful not to get too close to civilians, knowing that she might have to disappear on short notice for a mission. Now she could make real friendships. The HOA had also undergone major changes. The board had implemented strict background checks for all volunteers and had banned anyone from carrying weapons while doing HOA business. They had also hired a professional property management company to handle violations, taking that power away from individual volunteers. "We learned our lesson," the HOA president told Sarah. "Never again will we let someone like Rick Brennan terrorize our community." David had his own adjustments to make. Learning that his wife was Delta Force had been shocking, but it also explained many things about their marriage that had puzzled him. "I always wondered why you were so good in emergencies," David told Sarah one morning. "Remember when that tree fell across the road during the ice storm? You had traffic redirected and emergency crews called before anyone else even knew what to do." "I am trained to take charge in crisis situations," Sarah said. "It is automatic." David had also had to get used to the attention that came with being married to a local hero. The story of the Delta Force housewife had spread beyond their town, and Sarah occasionally got interview requests from news outlets. She always turned them down. "I did my job," Sarah told reporters. "That is all." But privately, Sarah was proud of how she had handled the situation. She had used exactly the right amount of force, enough to neutralize the threat but not enough to seriously injure Rick. She had protected innocent bystanders. And she had done it all while maintaining her composure and following her training. "You probably saved lives," Colonel Richards had told her during her last performance review. Rick Brennan was escalating. If you had not stopped him, he might have eventually hurt someone who could not defend themselves. Sarah had not thought about it that way, but she realized the colonel was right. Rick's behavior had been getting worse every week. His anger and frustration were building toward an explosion. Sarah had just happened to be the target when that explosion finally came. 1 year after the incident, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. Detective Santos came to the house with news about Rick. "He wants to apologize to you," Detective Santos said. "He has been in therapy in prison and his therapist thinks it would help his rehabilitation." Sarah considered this. "What kind of apology?" "A letter. He is not allowed to contact you directly, but his therapist asked if you would be willing to read it." Sarah thought about it for a few days before agreeing. The letter arrived a week later. "Mrs. Martinez," the letter began, "I know that I cannot undo what I did to you and your neighbors. I was angry and frustrated with my life, and I took it out on innocent people. I especially want to apologize for pulling a gun on you. I realize now how close I came to ruining many lives, including my own. I have learned in therapy that I was trying to feel powerful because I felt so powerless in other areas of my life. I chose to terrorize people who I thought could not fight back. I was wrong about you specifically, but that does not make what I did any less terrible. I am getting help now, and I hope that when I get out of prison, I can find better ways to deal with my problems. I will never bother you or your neighbors again. I hope that someday you can forgive me, but I understand if you cannot. Thank you for stopping me before I hurt someone. I know now that if you had not been trained to defend yourself, I might have done something much worse. Sincerely, Rick Brennan." Sarah showed the letter to David that evening. "What do you think?" David asked. "I think he means it," Sarah said. "But I also think it does not really matter. What matters is that he can never hurt anyone the way he hurt our neighbors." David nodded. Are you going to write back? Sarah thought about it. No, but I'm glad he is getting help. As Sarah looked back on the events of that dramatic weekend, she realized that it had changed her life in ways she never expected. She had lost her cover identity, but she had gained something more valuable: the ability to be honest about who she was. She was Sarah Martinez, Delta Force operator, suburban wife, neighborhood protector, and friend. She no longer had to hide any part of herself. The perfect neighborhood was still perfect, but now it was perfect in a real way, not just a superficial one. The residents knew each other. They looked out for each other. They were not afraid, and Sarah Martinez, who had spent 15 years protecting strangers in foreign countries, had finally found a place where she could protect the people she cared about most: her neighbors, her community, and her family. On quiet Sunday mornings, Sarah liked to sit on her front porch with her coffee and watch the neighborhood wake up. Children rode their bikes on the sidewalks. Families walked their dogs. People worked in their gardens. It looked just like it had when she and David first moved to Willowbrook Estates, seeking a quiet suburban life. But now Sarah knew that she was not just living in this community, she was part of it. And if anyone ever threatened it again, they would have to deal with her. The thought made her smile as she sipped her coffee and watched another perfect morning unfold in her not-so-perfect but absolutely real neighborhood.